Daniel Dillon, The Widow's Silence, written by Tane Blackadder, read by Arthur Howard. The night she found us, the heavens had opened not in sorrow, but in fury. It was not the weeping, gentle rain that sometimes blesses our city, offering a fleeting cleanse. No, this was a hard, relentless downpour, a torrential assault that hammered the pavement with a sound like 1,000 frantic fists. It transformed the world outside Mel's griddle into a distorted, liquid painting. The vibrant neon signs from the bar across the street, usually so sharp and declarative, were now just bleeding, shapeless smears of color against a canvas of oppressive black. This was a storm that seemed born of frustration, a deluge that felt like the sky's final, desperate attempt to scour the streets clean of their accumulated grime and hidden sins. But the city, our old and stubborn city, was refusing the ablution. The water simply gathered in oily, shimmering pools in the potholes, swirling with the day's discarded truths, but failing to carry them away. The rain wasn't purifying. It was just making the secrets float to the surface for a moment, before they settled back into the cracks in the concrete. And into this waterlogged confessional atmosphere she appeared, a solitary figure materializing from the curtain of water, a silhouette hesitating at the edge of the light we cast onto the sidewalk. She was a spectre born on the storm, a messenger the weather itself had delivered to our door. Margaret Hale materialized from the sheeting rain, a solitary figure paused in the act of becoming a client. The diner's grimy light spilled onto the sidewalk, forming a hazy orange-tinted aura around her, a spotlight on a stage she never asked to occupy. She was 68 years old, but time had worked on her in a particular way. It had not merely aged her, it had refined her down to her essential elements. Her frame was slight, almost bird-like, and seemed impossibly fragile for the colossal, invisible burden she carried. Yet, her posture defied the expectation of collapse. She stood not with a slump of defeat, but with a brittle, upright dignity, a quiet defiance that suggested her spine was forged from a century-old oak, something weathered and scarred by countless seasons, but with a core that had not yet splintered. Her face was a testament to a life fully lived, a landscape of fine lines and wrinkles that spoke of laughter earned and sunlight endured. But these familiar contours were now overshadowed by a new, more brutal geography. The most recent terrain was carved by a grief of such profound depth that it had ceased to be a visitor, and had instead taken up permanent grim residence in the set of her jaw and the hollows beneath her eyes. She didn't approach our door with purpose. Instead, she hovered before it, a soul caught between the tempest at her back and the unknown sanctuary within. One pale hand was lifted, pressed flat against the wet glass as if testing its reality, or perhaps seeking a connection to the life inside. The other clutched a worn leather handbag, holding it tight against her chest with a white-knuckled grip. It wasn't just a purse, it was a shield, a last piece of armor in a world that had already taken everything else. In that moment, she was the very portrait of a human being standing at the absolute precipice of hope, terrified to take the final step inside. Daniel's focus, which had been turned inward, navigating the relentless weather of his own memories, abruptly shifted. A subtle but unmistakable change came over him. The 1,000-yard stare that so often held him captive dissolved, his gaze sharpening into a blade's point of pure, present-moment awareness. He had seen her. In the years since his world fractured, words have become a scarce currency for him, doled out only when absolutely necessary. But he has developed a different, more profound language, an instinctual radar that vibrates to the frequency of utter human exhaustion, to the specific silence of a soul standing on the very last plank of its endurance. Without a sound, he unfolded himself from the booth, his movement not just quiet but fluid, almost spectral. He crossed to the door and pulled it open, not with a jarring suddenness, but with a measured sweep. He offered no greeting, asked no question that would force her to find a voice she likely didn't possess. Instead, he performed a single, eloquent action. He stepped back, creating a space. It was a gesture devoid of ceremony, yet profoundly meaningful. It was an invitation into our world of shadows, but also a silent acknowledgement of the tempest she was fleeing. In that simple, wordless act, he wasn't just opening a door, he was granting a temporary, fragile sanctuary from the storm. The moment Daniel began to move, a corresponding shift occurred within me. It's an unspoken choreography we've perfected, a dance of roles played without rehearsal. As he became the silent sentinel granting entry, my own instincts propelled me toward the coffee urn, its familiar stained facade, a beacon of mundane routine in the face of the unknown. This is my purpose in our fractured trio. When the world delivers its chaos to the cracked vinyl of our booth, I am the steward of order. I balance the ledgers, I manage the practicalities, and most importantly, I provide the small, tangible anchors, the warm mug, the clean napkin, that give trembling hands a purpose when the weight of unspoken words becomes unbearable. But as my fingers brushed against the cool ceramic of the coffee mugs, I hesitated. The acrid, bitter brew that fuels our nocturnal investigations felt too harsh, too confrontational for the delicate aura of sorrow this woman carried with her. Tonight demanded something different. I reached for the small, rarely used tin of chamomile tea instead, something gentle, something offering the illusion of comfort. She allowed Daniel to guide her to our table, her movements so slow and meticulously controlled they seemed to defy gravity itself. It was the cautious, precise progression of someone navigating a room filled with invisible fissures, terrified that one misstep, one sudden gesture, would cause her entire being to shatter into irretrievable pieces. She lowered herself into the booth, and the aged vinyl emitted a soft, sighing protest under her slight weight, as if sharing her burden. When I placed the steaming mug before her, she acknowledged it with a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Her fingers, as they curled around the chipped surface, betrayed a fine, constant tremor, a vibration of sustained shock so subtle that only Sarah, with her healer's perception, and I, for minute discrepancies, would have ever detected it. Sarah, for her part, did not look away. She watched Margaret with a quiet, focused empathy that was more potent than any outpouring of pity. Her gaze was that of a fellow survivor. She was not seeing a stranger, but recognizing a member of a club no one wishes to join. Her own past horrors had gifted her with an intimate, terrible understanding of the kind of trauma that leaves the body unscathed while devastating the landscape within. And then, into the heavy, tea-scented air, Margaret Hale began to speak. Her voice was a low, reedy sound, like the whisper of wind through a long-abandoned instrument. It was a voice stripped of ornamentation, a tool that had been neglected, used only for the barest necessities of existence for a very long time. It was the sound of a story that could no longer be contained. The story she had carried for 6 months finally escaped her lips, each word a painful exhalation. "My husband," she began, the title catching in her throat. "Richard." She couldn't finish his name. "It has been half a year." She described the scene not with graphic detail, but with the stark, simple language of irrevocable fact. He had been discovered in the place he'd tinkered and puttered for decades, suspended in the dusty, oil-stained silence of their detached garage. The image she conjured was not one of violence, but of a profound and terrible stillness. With a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts, she drew a single stark manila folder from her handbag, handling it as if its edges were razor-sharp. This was the official record, the police report. It was a study in cold, bureaucratic finality, a document that sought to reduce a complex human life to a handful of checked boxes and a single devastating conclusion. The word suicide was stamped across it, not merely typed, but imprinted with the full, impersonal weight of the state. The case, to the authorities, was the kind they appreciate most, open and shut. They had constructed a tidy, convenient narrative, tailor-made for an overworked precinct. A retired man, they said, a miner who had spent 40 years in the dark belly of the earth, now supposedly struggling with a darkness of the mind. The story wrote itself. The weight of an empty future, the gnawing anxiety of a pension that was dwindling far quicker than the sand in the hourglass of his life. It was a tragic, yet easily digestible tale. They had taken the sprawling, messy novel of Richard Hale's existence, and they had closed the file, boxing him up as just another statistic of quiet despair. But the tremor in Margaret's hand as she touched that folder screamed what her voice could not, that some stories are too neat to be true. But Margaret did not believe it, not for a single solitary second. Her hands, now resting on the table, were still. It was her eyes that betrayed her. They held a fire that had not been extinguished by grief, only banked and focused into a single unwavering certainty. "He wasn't a man who would leave me that way," she said, and the simple conviction in her tone was more powerful than any shouted denial. "He promised." She opened the folder. It was thin, heartbreakingly so. A life reduced to a death certificate, a coroner's brief summary, and a single typewritten letter. The police had presented the letter as Richard's suicide note, a vague apology, a mention of overwhelming despair. It was the kind of thing designed to provide closure at a glance. But I have spent my life with documents. Numbers don't lie, and neither does the physicality of ink on paper. Even from across the table I could see it. The font was a standard modern word processor default, but the signature was a clumsy forgery. The loops of Richard's name were too hesitant, the pressure inconsistent, the flow broken. It was a child's attempt at an adult's hand. My eyes met Daniel's. A silent question passed between us, the kind of communication forged in 2 years of shared trenches. He saw the truth in my face. This wasn't just a widow's denial, this was a cover-up. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper, so low we had to lean in to hear her over the drumming rain. She seemed to shrink into herself, as if the very act of speaking the words aloud was dangerous. He was the treasurer for the old miners' union, for 30 years. He was quiet about it, but the last few weeks, he was different, agitated. He said he'd found something in the books, something they didn't want known. Her finger, thin and lined, tapped the forged letter. He said he'd show me everything when he was ready, when it was safe. Her voice broke on the last word. Then he was gone. Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached across the table, her own hand capable and gentle from a life of healing, covering Margaret's. The gesture was one of pure, unvarnished solidarity. "We'll find out what really happened," she said, and her voice held no hollow promise, only a quiet, granite resolve. "We'll find the truth for you." And so we began. The trail was cold, but the stench of corruption was fresh. Our investigation led us away from the city's heart and into the scarred, forgotten hinterlands of the old goldfields, a landscape of shuttered mine shafts that stood like broken teeth against the grey sky, and dusty pubs where bitter men drank away their black lung and broken promises. The union's financial records, which I painstakingly pieced together from archived files and whispered rumours, were an accountant's nightmare. They were a labyrinth of shell accounts and phantom expenses, a river of membership dues and pension contributions being systematically diverted, siphoned off into pockets that had never felt the grime of a mine shaft. And at the centre of this financial rot, one name kept appearing with damning frequency: Elias Venter. He had been Richard's best friend, his union brother, his closest confidant for 4 decades. Daniel tracked Venter to a dim, sawdust-floored tavern that smelled of stale beer and regret. I waited outside in our car, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the downpour, watching through the rain-streaked window. I saw Daniel approach the bar, a broad, stooped man who looked like he carried the weight of the earth itself in his shoulders. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the language of the confrontation. Daniel didn't threaten, didn't posture. He simply leaned in, his presence a physical pressure, his words quiet and sharp as scalpels. He was a surgeon operating on a guilty conscience. And Venter, his face crumbling under the weight of 6 months of silent complicity, cracked within minutes. The truth he spilled was uglier, more intimate in its cruelty than any of us had feared. Richard Hale had not killed himself. He had discovered the massive fraud, the theft from the very men he'd sworn to protect. He had confronted the union leadership, and Venter, weak and terrified, had been coerced by men far higher up the food chain to help stage the suicide. They had written the note, They had used his friendship to lure Richard to the garage on a pretext. The method was cold, efficient, and designed to send a message to anyone else who might think of asking questions. But the final devastating blow was yet to come. The person who had provided the key to the garage, who had confirmed Richard's whereabouts, who had helped sell the story of his despondency to the police, was their own son. A man drowning in gambling debts, who had been promised that his father's sacrifices would wipe his slate clean and guarantee his mother's protection. The drive back to Margaret's small, tidy house was made in absolute silence. When Daniel, his voice stripped of all but the barest facts, laid out the truth for her, her reaction was not what any of us expected. There were no tears, no cries of anguish or rage. She simply folded inward. Her face, which had been a map of grief, went blank, smooth, as if the final, terrible truth had erased even the ability to feel it. The silence that filled her neat living room was absolute, a void more profound than any sound. It was the stillness of a soul that has just learned it has nothing left to lose. I sat beside her on the floral-patterned sofa, not speaking. There were no words. It was the way you sit beside a ledger that has a fundamental, irreconcilable error at its core, a column of numbers that will never, ever balance, no matter how many times you run the calculation. You can fix a broken sum, you can expose a financial fraud. But the arithmetic of human betrayal, a husband murdered by his brothers, a wife shattered by her child, that is an equation with no solution. Daniel walked her to her car when the rain had finally softened to a mist. Sarah lingered, her hand on Margaret's arm, whispering words of comfort that sounded less like reassurance and more like a quiet, fierce prayer for strength. And I stood on the wet pavement, the cold seeping through my shoes, thinking about the sums that never come out right. The pension stolen, the friendship betrayed, the love twisted into a weapon. When Margaret drove away, her car disappearing into the gloom, she looked smaller, not just older or wearier, but as if the revelation had physically diminished her, as if the truth had taken the last solid thing inside her and left only a hollow shell. That night, back in the silence of my own apartment, I opened my personal journal. I wrote down the facts of the case, the numbers, the names. Another file closed. Another ghost accounted for in my own private ledger. But the silence Margaret Hale left behind in our booth, a silence born not of mystery, but of a truth too terrible to give voice to, that silence stayed with us. It seeped into the vinyl. It hung in the air with the smell of old coffee, a new and permanent resident in our world of echoes.